Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. What a pleasure. I'm Will Howell. I'm a faculty member here at the Harris School. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department and the director of the Center for Effective Government. And we're really pleased to launch this event wherein we're going to welcome our new cohort of practitioner fellows as part of the Center for Effective Government. At the center, we think long and hard about the kinds of institutional reforms that we need to build a more effective government. That is, a government that can solve problems, actually get to work and make progress on the things that we at the Harris School care a lot about, trying to address in a meaningful way. And we see deep problems with our politics that impede and distort efforts to attend to those problems. And we want to surface ideas about how to constructively address them. We do that through scholarship, we do that through education, we do that through engaging the kinds of stellar practitioners we have before us who've devoted their lives to thinking long and hard about how do we reform our government to make it more transparent, to make it more efficacious, to make it more, what we would say, effective. There's lots of language to use, but this is a terrific group, and we're really pleased to be able to introduce them to you here in person and to you who are joining us online. And I'm going to keep this short because I want to get out of the way, and we are really excited to have our dean with us, Kate Baker. I get to read this. You've introduced me a few times. I get to do this with you, which is a joy. Kate is the Dean and Emmett Dedman Professor at the University of Chicago, and she's a leading scholar in the economic analysis of health policy, whose research focuses on the effectiveness of public and private health insurance, including the effective reforms on the distribution and quality of care. I'll say, in addition to being a terrific dean here at the Harris School, she also has been a friend of and great supporter of the Center for Effective Government, and it's been just a joy working alongside her. And so, Kate, thanks for being here.
Let's clap for Will. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to see you all here, and I know we have a live audience joining online as well, and it is easy to be a friend to CEG. The work that the organization does could not be more important than it is right now, and I'm delighted to welcome this really impressive cohort of fellows and hope that you all have a chance to interact with them over the coming period because they bring enormous wealth of experience and talent to bear on some of the most tangled problems that we are all wrestling with. The Harris School, as Professor Howell mentioned, is grounded in the idea that we only solve problems when we bring evidence to bear. There are lots of things that sound like nice ideas that don't bear out in reality, and we are champions for evidence-based, analytically rigorous policy solutions to the things that matter most. Well, that's all well and good until you try to implement them in the real world. And then it turns out that politics is a very messy sport, and it is a very messy place to try to get things done. And when government is ineffective, it really limits all of the tools we have to improve people's lives. I work on health policy. CEG and fellows have addressed issues from prison reform to health policy to educational attainment to understanding what the very threats to democracy are that we're facing. And it has been a very sobering couple of years in the US and around the world when you look at the threats to democracy, when you look at the role of misinformation and disinformation, when you look at the disempowerment of people to affect their elected governments, when you look at war in Europe, war around the world, breakdown of civil society. I don't mean to sound glum, but we have to fix our politics if we're going to be able to bring those innovative policy solutions to bear on problems that affect individual people's lives and problems that affect the globe, from individual hunger to climate change. We really need the work of practitioners to be able to intersect with the work of scholars and of students. And one of the things that I'm most excited about, CEG takes these problems really seriously and brings that analytical lens to bear. Again, there is a lot of hot air out in the world and very few people taking the underlying ideas with the seriousness that they deserve, and that's what CEG is here to do, and not only to think about how might we do things better in principle, Academics are really good at sitting in their offices and thinking about how things might work out in principle. We can write down a really nice model for you, but that's not helpful if you can't figure out how to bridge academic and scholarly insights to real-world implementation and understanding the institutional context in which those policies may or may not get enacted. And that bridge is one of the greatest powers of CEG. And what we see here in our Senior Practitioner Fellowship group is the power of convening real-world experts, people with experience and accomplishments in the policy realm, to be a resource and inspiration for our faculty and our students. And this is the second cohort that we've seen, and I could not be more thrilled that Harris is able to host this program, because the practitioners are able to make all of our work better. I hope that as academics and scholars were able to provide information that's useful in that direction as well. I know so many of our students are yearning to go into public policy, either in government or in social entrepreneurship, and really make a difference. And the senior practitioners are also an incredible resource to our students in thinking about how you navigate a career in an increasingly fraught environment. So this is a wonderful program. I'm thrilled to call myself a friend of CEG, and I hope a friend of all of you, and I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to Sadia Sindhu to talk about this evening's program.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for being here. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, you can. Hi, everyone. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Effective Government, and I will be moderating tonight's conversation. But before I turn to questions, I want to take a couple of minutes to introduce our Senior Practitioner Fellows. So I'll start with Tiana. Tiana Epps-Johnson is the founder and executive director of the Center for Tech and Civic Life. She is leading a team that is doing groundbreaking work to make U.S. elections more inclusive and secure. Prior to CTCL, she was the New Organizing Institute's Election Administration Director, and she had previously worked on the Voting Rights Project for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Tiana is a 2021 Emerson Collective Dial Fellow, a recipient of the 2022 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, and was selected to join the inaugural cohort of the Obama Foundation's Fellows. She also served as a fellow at the Harvard Ash Center for Technology and Democracy, and she earned her BA at Stanford University and her MSc in Politics and Communications from the London School of Economics. And Tiana is based here in Chicago, so we're just thrilled to have a local as well. So thank you, Tiana.
It was an easy trip down.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Rudy Mehrabani. I rearranged them right before. So Rudy Mehrabani is a senior director for governance at the Democracy Fund, an independent foundation working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. Rudy was previously a senior fellow and senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy center. From 2016 to 2021, he was a member of the J. William Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board, where he served as the board's vice chair. The board was established by Congress to supervise the Fulbright program and select students, scholars, and teachers. He's had a distinguished career in law and public service and has served as an assistant to President Barack Obama and as director of the Personnel Office in the White House. He has served as general counsel for the Peace Corps, as well as an associate counsel and special assistant in the White House. He has served in a variety of other roles in the executive branch, and he kicked off his career at Kirkland and Ellis here in Chicago. He has a BA from Emory University and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. And Rudy, you're technically a Chicago.
Oh, absolutely.
Too, right? We can say that.
To the heart, yeah.
Yes. And then we have Mindy Finn. Mindy is a civic entrepreneur who has led large-scale campaigns and initiatives to improve politics, polarization, and voting throughout her extensive nonprofit and for-profit career. She is the founder and CEO of Citizen Data, a startup data marketplace for a stronger democracy that uses the power of AI and behavioral science to bridge divides, make critical decisions, and advance solutions to urgent societal challenges. Its products are rooted in a deep belief in the power of every individual and community to play in building a more resilient and inclusive democracy. Prior to Citizen, Mindy served as co-founder and ED of Stand Up Republic. She's also served as a campaign strategist for George W. Bush and Mitt Romney and has held legislative roles in the U.S. House and Senate. Mindy's passion for reform led her to the campaign trail in 2016, where she ran for Vice President of the United States on an independent ticket alongside former CIA operative Evan McMullen. Mindy earned her bachelor's degree in journalism from Boston University and a master's degree in political management at George Washington University. And then finally, we have Liz Hempowicz. Liz is the Director of Public Policy at the Project on Government Oversight. She develops and advances policy solutions to combat corruption and to promote openness and accountability in government. She strategizes the best ways to translate POGO's report findings into legislative reforms or executive action. She has participated in efforts to improve the Inspector General Act, the National Emergency Act, lobbying and congressional ethics rules, whistleblower protections, the Freedom of Information Act, and other government accountability initiatives. Liz is an expert on all that I just described. She has also testified before Congress several times and is frequently cited in news outlets, including CNBC, the Associated Press, NPR, the New York Times, The Post, and Politico. She earned her JD from American University's Washington College of Law, and she served as the managing editor of the Legislation and Policy Brief, and she earned her BA International Political Economy and Diplomacy at the University of Bridgeport. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving us the honor of properly introducing you all to this audience. So I want to start off with something that is a bit broad, but I think speaks to all the work that you've done. In the past several years, we've witnessed many instances of democratic backsliding, not only across the globe, but specifically here in the US. Each of you, in either your individual capacity or the capacity of your organization, are working to reverse this trend. What is the single most important challenge that faces our democracy, and how does your work address that? And I'll let one of you volunteer with the first answer for that very difficult question.
It is such a big question.
I know, right?
You didn't start with an easy one.
I'm happy to kick us off.
That would be
Sure.
great.
I feel like I'm in the hot seat. What a big question. I think that a place to start might be helping to share how I come to this conversation. I lead an organization called the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. And I was joking earlier that I used to be on like the innovation beat. Like the talks that I was invited to were to talk about the way that technology was this huge, incredible promise for the future of democracy. And over the last 5 years or so, now I am in conversations that are about, will democracy survive through the next election? And it's been a quick shift in the conversations that we all are in. My work focuses on two core things. It's focused on supporting the folks that administer our elections, that make our voting process actually happen, do that work effectively so that they're able to run inclusive, secure elections that are smooth and work for everybody who wants to show up and cast a ballot. And we know that for people to effectively engage in our elections, but also in civic life broadly, it's helpful to have information about the folks who are running for office, what they stand for, who eventually wins office. And so we also do work to make sure that that's really easy to find for the public. To make it really concrete, a couple of our greatest hits. If you look in a Google search browser and ask who's the governor of Illinois, you'll get J.B. Pritzker, and you'll see that the first source is CTCL. When after 2016, cybersecurity would have been my answer to the biggest threat to democracy. We responded by helping election departments with training to tackle that issue. Today, when I reflect on this long list of things that could be at the top, the number one challenge that we see as the most urgent right now is that our elections and the infrastructure that underpins it has been underfunded for decades, and we are at a point where the technology, the basic facilities, and the people who underpin our election are being pushed to the brink. We're seeing in communities across the country voting equipment that's over a decade old and no longer reliable. We are seeing threats and attacks to the staff that are critical for actually making the process work. And the tools that they have are just not up for the a 21st century job of serving voters. And so to my mind right now, that is the most important and challenging thing that we're facing in democracy.
I kind of want to pick up on what you, sorry, I don't mean to skip to the end of the line. Okay, I want to pick up on what you were talking about, Tiana, around elections, because I think you are focusing rightfully on kind of the infrastructure of our elections, and kind of my answer is maybe the flip side of that, which is, one thing that we saw coming out of the 2020 election was kind of exactly what you're talking about, kind of the strain that, the physical strain that our election system is under right now. I think on the other side, I think of the insurrection on the 6th, and the lack of public faith in the integrity of our elections and the integrity of our government institutions. And so that's what I guess that would be my answer, I think, to this question, is that rapidly declining faith in those institutions. And I think about the insurrection, right, because it was built in part on misinformation, but it wasn't just misinformation, because we had all these government actors. I mean, even Bill Barr said, Trump's attorney general saying there wasn't massive voter fraud in this election. This is a legitimate election. And that didn't matter, because people don't trust what comes out of government officials' mouths anymore. And so POGO comes at it and I come at my work from the perspective of how do we rebuild some of that trust and faith in those institutions. And we can't ask the public to take it on blind faith alone. So how do we build that trust with the public? How do we show the public that the government means what it's saying or is being straight up? And so that's why, for a long time, my pet issue that I came to POGO to work on was the Freedom of Information Act, kind of the ability, because it blew my mind when I first heard about FOIA, when I was in college. There's like a statutory right to demand information from our government. I'm a reality TV junkie. I love access to information. So this is amazing, right? It's like, tell me everything that's going on. I want to see all your emails, and I want to know how you made these decisions that you made in my name and with my tax dollars. And so not just that, though, it's also whistleblower protections and making sure that those inside government who see things going wrong feel safe coming forward, and that their careers will be okay, that their personal lives will be fine, and also that the issues they're raising will be addressed. So that's another big one. We talk about, or we're working a lot on kind of those independent oversight mechanisms within government, but also within government. Yeah, Congress counts as government, but kind of even between the branches of government. So all of those things really that are just meant to show the public what is the government doing. And so I'll just close it out with something that I think is maybe the most detached from kind of what I was talking about with the insurrection and the election, how we led into it, but is another big part of the work that we're trying to do, and what I'd like to focus on this year, and that's also transparency into federal spending generally. And this came out, we're thinking about this in terms of all the trillions of dollars spent in COVID relief money, and the fact that we can't answer really basic questions about what we accomplished with that spending. And we won't be able to, frankly. The government does not collect the data it needs to be able to answer really basic questions like how many jobs did the Paycheck Protection Program actually support? The whole point of that program. Anyway, now I'll end my rant, but I think really it's not just the physical infrastructure of these things, it's also the integrity and the public's confidence in what we're doing to make sure that we are guarding that public trust, not just asking the public to trust government blindly.
So to dive in, so Liz talks about information. Kind of like Tiana, a lot of my career, I was focused on digital and data and politics as holding promise to truly democratize democracy, small d, because it was giving more people a voice. It was allowing more transparency about what's happening behind the scenes in our institutions. It was making people feel more included. It could potentially improve our voting. And all those things are true, but we've also learned that the open information space that we have holds a lot of danger for our democracy as well, and has been the catalyst for a lot of division, disinformation, and the lack of trust that Liz is talking about. What I focus on a lot in our work through Citizen is that, first of all, we have a system that is very complex. So when we talk about what is the threat, the reason that's a hard question to answer is that a lot of these threats kind of hang together. So polarization is tied directly to disinformation, is tied directly to lack of trust in elections, is tied to lack of trust in institutions, is tied to political violence, and on and on and on. Tied to the kinds of leaders that get elected. All these pieces are really interrelated in our system. But if I have to boil it down to the essence of what I think the biggest threat is, it is it's not just, it's polarization, but it's also not having a shared set of facts and a shared set of truth. given the information space that we have today. And from my perspective, kind of in our work, that undergirds all of these other makes it much harder to address these other challenges. I think the dean spoke in her opening remarks about it's one thing to create evidence-based policy and use data to come up with what is the best policy. We have a lot of expertise focused on that. I mean, one of the exciting opportune moments is that there's more of the public within academic settings and otherwise as practitioners tuned into the need to address the fact that democracy is in crisis and that we need to focus on it. But the real challenge, the challenge to implement a lot of those changes and evidence-based policy is really tied back to the polarization that is caused by the lack of shared truth and the lack of shared facts.
In a lot of ways, it's this question, it's almost the hardest to go last, which maybe is why everybody jumped in first. Just quick, I just want to thank Sadia and Dion and Professor Howell and the Center for the warm welcome and for having us here. I'm always thrilled to come to Chicago, and you gave me a nice excuse to do so. I guess what I'm hearing, and all of us come at this problem from different angles. And I think one of the major problems, or perhaps a consequence of what my colleagues articulated so well, is that there's no longer, I feel like in our politics, a shared sense that we are all in this together, right? There is this view that your political opponents now are your enemies. And I mean that in a very real way. And we saw how that materialized in the insurrection on January 6th. And particularly in this environment where around the world we are now having a debate about what it means to be a democracy fighting authoritarianism, and people are losing their lives to defend democracy, I think that it is an opportunity for all of us to start taking seriously what it means to be a part of the same country and to be a part of the same democracy together. And from the work that I do, both at the Democracy Fund and what I worked on before going to the Democracy Fund, I tried specifically to build up government so that it could deliver better for the people. I think that part of what government needs to do is to do what it says, right? And so if government says that they're gonna support businesses in the middle of a pandemic to ensure that they're able to survive during a shutdown, they need to be able to deliver on that in a way that's equitable, that's transparent, so people can see where their taxpayer dollars are going. And they need to make sure that they're accountable when there's wrongdoing. If money is spent inappropriately, if people take advantage of the system, if they use it to enrich themselves rather than further the public interest, there needs to be accountability for that. So those are big problems. I know we'll dive into all of this in more detail, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you all. And I started intentionally with sort of a big question, because I think each of you, you're addressing issues that our democracies face, not only here in the US, but globally at such a critical time. And a couple months ago, we came to you and we asked you to join us for a year-long fellowship. In the midst of all this, can you share a little bit about why you chose to, what are you hoping to advance in this fellowship with the Center for Effective Government and in this larger conversation here at the University of Chicago? Woody, you get to start this time.
You will snake? All right, I'll start. Sure, so I'm really excited to dig in. I mean, there's no shortage of issues that require a lot of smart people from different backgrounds and different perspectives to help contribute and brainstorm to the issues. I think one of the opportunities that President Biden, I think, has really taken advantage of in assuming office has been a renewed interest to work on some of the fundamentals of how government functions, right? Starting from how you bring people into government, how you recruit them, how you keep them interested, how you respect the work that career professionals do, not demonize them as being opposed to you or your political agenda, and ensure that the policymaking processes that go on within government agencies are responsible, inclusive, and lead to beneficial outcomes. So there right now is active conversation. The administration has already implemented a number of positive steps in this direction. They're working on ways to improve technology within government. help ensure delivery of services more effectively to people. There are efforts to ensure that we're diversifying the way federal agencies operate and ensure that they better represent America as a whole and the various interests that we have across the country. But there's still a lot more to do. We learned, I think, more than anything else during the Trump administration. Look, agencies at the federal level have been degrading for decades. I am not one of these people that lays blame to Donald Trump for all of the problems that we witnessed over his administration. But I do think that he took advantage of that erosion, and people within his administration took advantage of that erosion for their own political ends. And if nothing else, that administration highlighted some of the biggest problems with the ways agencies function, and we need to respond to those. Now that they've been brought out into the light, we need to respond to those, and Congress and the American people need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that, because if we don't respond, then in a way there's a roadmap for a successor to not only repeat the same abuses that we saw, but also intensify that effort so that it's taken to the nth level. And as we talked about in the response to the previous question, the consequences would be catastrophic to democracy.
I found myself laughing not because what you were talking about, Rudy, was funny, but because you're exactly right. I mean, when you say that the Trump administration highlighted all the weaknesses in our federal government, I mean, when I first started doing this work, I had to spend like 30 minutes trying to convince anybody I talked to about whistleblowers why they were not something to be scared of or feared, or like that these are people that should be revered inside our government, that they are doing a public service. I never have to have that conversation again, because whether Republicans and Democrats, I think, understand and certainly, you know, it is a lot of these issues that hadn't been partisan before became hyper-partisan under Trump, under former President Trump. But you know, anyway, so I don't have to have that conversation anymore. People understand kind of why this stuff matters in a way that I don't know, frankly, if they quite did before. I think the pandemic also helped crystallize for people the role that government could play in your life, and could play for people in a crisis, and also showed us just how poorly our government is set up right now, or our leadership at the time was set up to rise to that moment and meet that occasion. But to your direct question of kind of why say yes to the fellowship now and in this moment, I gotta be really honest with you guys, it's so selfish, but I'm here to kind of feed off of your optimism and your excitement and hope for the future. It is, you know, we were talking before we came out here, I'm not very fun anymore because I want to talk about all the ways democracy is crumbling. But a couple weeks ago, I spoke with one of your colleagues. I did like an informational coffee interview, and I walked away from it being like so excited about the possibility for the future, and just knowing, you know, yes, we are trying to save our democracy from slipping through our fingers, but we also have a moment to build something that is so much more equitable and so much more responsive to the needs of our country as it changes. And so there's also that excitement, and so I'm really hoping to kind of really suck that enthusiasm and optimism from you guys, and really kind of you know, hear a little bit more how we can be talking about these issues in a way that breaks through kind of the DC bubble, which I've been in for a little while and never really want to be totally you know, within that echo chamber.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I mean, what I am most excited about is that this is a moment where I think there's no one that feels they have a monopoly on the best solutions and the best ideas. So, as Liz said, students always are really inspiring with the ways that they are thinking about the future, both the optimism that students bring, you know, but also the energy and the hunger to change. I find it just really puts wind in my sails. So to kind of mix that in with the day-to-day that can, as Liz says, get pretty depressing when you feel like what you're up against and that the challenges are so big and the barriers are so great, was really inspiring. The other piece is that the intersection with the Data and Democracy program, you know, as mentioned, you know, we're not putting Genie back in the bottle. So technology is only moving faster and into a place that is really hard for our institutions to adapt and keep up. And frankly, I think poses, you know, even greater kind of challenges to democracy by the day. And so to kind of take a step, that's the work I'm focusing on every day, but to take a step back and within this institution and connecting with academics who are also focused on the intersection of data and democracy for good and for improving governance and for bridging divides, which is kind of an opportunity that's hard to pass up.
For me, yes, everything that folks already lifted up. But also one of the things that has come through so clearly already is that the challenges that are at the core of our democracy right now are deeply interconnected, and that even though we are all working in different sectors, although me and Mindy closer than others, that we're facing many of the really the same root challenges. But even though that's true, oftentimes the work that we're each doing is deeply siloed in the part of democracy work that we do. I think about election misinformation, for example, through the lens of what can election departments, the official source of information, do to use their offices to elevate the most trusted information, but the way that other folks here think about it differently. And so I think one of the big opportunities, one of the reasons I said yes to this fellowship is because CEG is a place that convenes people across sectors, that brings together academics with practitioners. And so I'm really eager to explore things like, what conversation can we have about election misinformation or misinformation broadly, and the relationship between that and institutional decline and mistrust that can be had between election officials and public health workers and other government officials who are each feeling a different piece of this same environment of just mistrust and disinformation, but who are often trying to figure out and reinvent the wheel in their own sector, ways to solve for it. And so I'm really excited about opportunities to come together and figure out what are some of the common things that we have as challenges and ways that we might be able to come together around solutions. I think that the second piece is that I really love that intersection and that conversation between theory and practice. And right now, as we are facing just emergent and quickly emergent new challenges to our democracy. Again, in my space, that's been cybersecurity threats, and then election misinformation, and then a pandemic, and now election subversion. When the threats are moving so quickly, you also have to be willing to try things that are new as responses, and you want to do that in a place that is using rigorous inputs, and you want to know quickly, are you taking a step in the right direction, and if not, how do you correct that? And so I think at a sort of meta level, I'm really excited about exploring and thinking about how we can shorten that feedback loop between theory and practice, so that we can keep pace with the pace of challenges and do it in a really rigorous way.
That's absolutely perfect, because that leads right into the next piece, which is the Stat and Democracy Initiative that we had just launched. And Mindy, you alluded to it, and Tiana, what you're talking about is exactly in line with what we're hoping to do. As you think about trying things that are new and responsive to many of the challenges that you've shared here, are there specific reforms or ideas that you personally feel very strongly about and would like to explore over the next year or two? We've identified some of the challenges. I wonder, as you think about solutions, what are you most excited about learning more about? And then Liz and Rudy, I'll come to you as well. But I wanted to start with the data and democracy.
So one of the areas that I'm most interested, that increasingly we're spending a lot more of our energy on, the way our organization works is we work with a lot of partner organizations, mostly. So we basically partner with one or more entities to develop certain data sets or develop certain deliverables or address specific challenges. And so increasingly the demand, where the interest has been, is really around actually the communications and messaging challenge. Given how polarized we are, there's definitely a sense that people are just viewing two different realities of the world, and there's also a lot of coded language. There's obviously a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and yet there are actors or messengers in our society that are in government positions, including election officials, certainly community members and others, and we saw this in COVID as well, who are more trusted. And this is a time to really be empowering them with the tools in the toolbox that they need to transcend divides, to build that trust, to dispel myths with fact. And that is really difficult to do. And we don't yet have perfect ways to do that. The ways that you would go back to doing is to just answer myth with fact. And we are in a time when that is insufficient as a solution. It's certainly part of the solution, ensuring that there is truth and there are facts. Education is a piece of it, but there's another communications messaging piece as well. And I'll just note, speaking about interdisciplinary, I think someone mentioned COVID. One of kind of the experiences, talking about theory and practice, that we're leaning on in that work is work that we did on COVID vaccine education to reach conservative and rural communities, people who were kind of the last holdouts and who were hesitant. And there was a lot that didn't work, and there were some things that did work. And the things that worked in that context are really translatable. At least the hypothesis is that they're translatable when it comes to instilling trust in elections and trust in our institutions. And so we're testing a lot of that out.
For me, in addition to the sort of exploration around misinformation and what we can learn across government, I think I'm really also interested in the type of additional context that the public needs to make sense of some of the data or information that we make available to engage in elections. What do I mean by that? One really concrete but sort of basic thing I mean by that is that one of the things that we think could make a huge difference is better and greater participation in local government and local elections and local civic life. But we see a ton of attention to what happens at the federal level or federal elections. And so part of our hypothesis is that it's really challenging to make connections between your daily life and why you should care about your auditor or someone that sits on your library board or on a community development board, but these are actually the folks that are making the decisions that oftentimes are impacting your day-to-day life in the most significant ways. And so right now we have, over the last decade, built some really innovative tools to be able to connect people with answers to questions like what's on their ballot and who are their elected officials, but we want to continue to expand on the type of context that we can add to really allow folks to make those connections between their daily lives and how that relates to folks who are running for or are in office. And so, and I think that is one of the, building a better shared understanding about actual mechanisms to hold folks accountable and to push government to be responsive requires having this sort of baseline understanding, and so we hope to build some infrastructure towards that.
Thank you. And Rudy and Liz, both of you have provided congressional testimony getting behind specific reforms. I want to give you both space to share things that you're thinking about in this moment or something that you were excited about that didn't work out and what you're hoping that next iteration of that reform might look like.
Yeah, I can kick us off. So actually, I'll kick us off with the testimony I'm about to give this next week is on the issue of congressional stock trading, and it's something that the public has been really interested in, and it goes back to something that didn't quite work out the way Congress had intended it to, which was the Stock Act that they passed in 2012, which really made absolutely no changes to what members of Congress could do with regards to buying and selling individual or holding individual stocks. It just said that when they bought or sold stocks, they had to disclose that information to the public within 45 days. What we've seen now is a huge, members of Congress consistently outperform the market, and the public is actually following members of Congress. Well, the public is both outraged. One section of the public is really upset about this, that members of Congress are allowed to insider trade with almost total impunity because of the speech and debate clause. And then there's a second subset of the public that is following these trades really closely because they want to mirror them, because they want to get in on the action too. And so next week I'll be testifying on that, and we've got a great proposal on how members of Congress can really reduce their financial conflicts of interest. And again, it ties back to everything we're talking about, kind of building those faith in institutions, because the public is really upset when they think that members of Congress or any other policymaker is making decisions based on their own financial gain rather than the public interest or the public good or what their constituents want. And I mean, imagine that, right? Like that's so wild that the public public would be mad about that. But so that's one thing. I think other reforms that we're working on really hard right now, like I mentioned earlier, whistleblower protections. It's been a long time since we have since we've updated those protections. The way it works in the federal government essentially is that the whistleblower protections aren't like an affirmative protection. They're there for you to use the process that Congress has laid out for you to be made whole after you've suffered some kind of retaliation for blowing the whistle. And so because of that, we need folks within agencies get creative and they find new ways to retaliate, new ways to kind of get through the law and create new loopholes. And so this is really a space where Congress needs to be paying continual attention. And there's just a ton of loopholes in those laws, some that we saw really highlighted for the whole world during the first impeachment, but then others, that are also really serious that we saw during COVID, where people come forward with really serious concerns about how we're handling public health crises, and they're removed from their position or they're siloed, and they are, told you can't push back against this internally or you're going to lose your job. And it really does not build faith in these institutions or that government can work for the people. So those are two big things that we're working on right now, but always kind of everything. We're, POGO's mission, my mission every day when I go to work is to fix the federal government. So really, I say all the time, I'm an opportunist. I will work on anything that Congress is willing to get passed if it is going to make things better.
I hope you'll put us all out of work.
Yeah, me too.
So as a baseline, I feel like when people go into government, we should be able to expect that they're competent, qualified, and ethical. Like, I feel like that's the least that we could ask for when folks are going into government. And so in the congressional testimony that you referred to, Sadia, that where Liz and I testified together before the House Oversight Committee, a couple of things that we spoke to was the need, first, people need to be able to know what positions are vacant within government and who is occupying certain positions. So there's a piece of legislation referred to as the Plum Act that is currently being considered in Congress. It's named after the Plum Book, which is the book that lists all of the political appointments or plum jobs that are in the federal government. And the bill would put those positions online so that any member of the public could go and look to see which positions are vacant, who occupies them, and it would be continually updated. And so there's some work related to that. There's some hope and momentum. There's some hope that it'll pass. There's some momentum we're seeing in Congress right now. Another piece of legislation which President Trump, but also his predecessors, took advantage of in terms of the number of loopholes that exist in that legislation is the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. When I was in government, this was a very niche piece of legislation, and very few people even knew it existed. Whenever there was a question that came up about it in the agency or when I was in the White House, people would run to ask me questions about it because it wasn't something that was well known. I never knew that it would be something that would be talked about routinely or could have predicted that it would be something that would become a household name during the Trump administration. There are that piece of legislation needs to be reformed so that a president who wants to install cronies into whatever position he deems necessary to further his political interests isn't able to do that, and to ensure that there's necessary protections so that statutory qualifications and other issues are satisfied. So that is a bill that has been integrated into what is called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which is a larger good government piece of legislation that is on the Hill. And so there are those specific reforms, but more broadly, and I'm excited to dig in at the center and with the students here about this topic. How can we get young people more interested into serving in government? What are the changes that need to be made in the federal personnel process to make government attractive again? It used to be an ideal employer and something that people aspired toward is public service within the federal government, and that is no longer the case. And we are reaching a period within the executive branch where the percentage of people who will be eligible for retirement is just astonishing. The number of vacancies that exist in certain professional areas within the federal government and in certain areas they're reaching critical levels. The Government Accountability Office has listed things like anywhere from IT functions, cybersecurity functions, to human capital functions being at critical levels that require additional skills and expertise. So I'm looking forward to talking with your students, the faculty, and learning what we could do to improve that area.
Thank you. And I do have some student-facing questions, but I know we have students in the audience, so I'm going to let you all ask those questions, and I'll turn to you in just a minute. I think one thing that's really stood out in this conversation is just the breadth of challenges that our democracy faces. And a thing that we take very seriously at the University of Chicago, at the Harris School of Public Policy, at the Center for Effective Government is bringing folks who have very different views together in a productive way. It's not meant democracy reform work, institutional reform work, the work of effective government cannot be done in a silo. And in this increasingly polarized world, that becomes even more important. I wonder if that resonates with each of you. I suspect it does, but I hope you might be able to provide a bit about how that shows up in your work or your approach to your work. How are you bringing folks together, and what are some opportunities to do that?
I'm happy to kick us off. Actually, I've got two answers. One is, I think, just to underscore what you were saying is, Tiana, earlier when you were talking about kind of why we need data, and you were talking about in the context of elections, right? We need this data so that we can, see what's going wrong and change course if we need to. That's exactly that is exactly our operating principle going into the federal spending transparency work, is that we need to know early and often if federal programs aren't being equitably instituted, aren't having their intended effect, aren't reaching the communities they're supposed to reach, so that the government can make changes to the way those programs are being funded or are being implemented so that it can have the intended effect. So I think just there, right, is exactly how, and then I think the bigger answer to your question and really why I love working at the Project on Government Oversight, right? I joked earlier that our mission is so big. We're a really small, or not as small as we used to be, but rather small organization. And the way we're able to have such outsized impact and way we're able to kind of have such a big mission is focusing on the systemic thread in issues. And so I threw a lot of issues at you earlier. A lot of them also Rudy echoed, kind of whistleblowers, inspectors general, access to government information, spending transparency, Congress having access to information. They look on paper like they are not related, but at the end of the day, we are able to jump from one to the other because they are so related behind the scenes. And all you have to do is kind of look a little bit beyond kind of the program that you're looking at or the individual program you're looking at, and think more of like, what is the goal of what this program is supposed to accomplish, right? Whistleblowers, inspectors general, FOIA, all of the goal and the overarching theme of why we have these different pillars of accountability in our government is to make sure that the public is getting information they need, that Congress is getting the information they need to make decisions. And so I think kind of focusing and taking a step back and trying to dig a little deeper into what systemic issue are you touching on will help you think through not just, in a most practical sense, will help you think of the solution easier, I think, right? It's like apply some of the work others have done in other spaces to the problem that you're looking at. And you can only really do that, I think, if you're focusing on the systemic issue rather than kind of how it's presenting at the problem that you're looking at that day.
Maybe just for, before, it might make sense for me to go next, just to keep on the same theme. I think that there's two things I'll mention. The first, the backgrounds that people bring to their work and to the work that the federal government does is incredibly important. We used to have a saying in the Presidential Personnel Office where I worked that people are policy. And that might sound cliche, but it is absolutely true. You can have people who come from different backgrounds and who have different experiences, and they will emphasize different policy points when policy is being written, and more importantly, when policy is implemented. So one of the reasons I'm so passionate about making sure that more people from more backgrounds are interested in government service is because it impacts policy. It impacts what government does for people. The second thing I will say that government does not do enough of that we are trying to work on is going and talking to communities that are impacted by policies. And that doesn't mean doing it at the end of the policymaking process. It means doing it when policy is being considered, when ideas are being put together, when white papers are written. It needs to happen early in the process. And I think more and more, and we learned this during the pandemic, the vaccine rollout during the pandemic. We've learned it. We learned it. Sadly, it's a lesson we keep on having to learn again and again. But during the stimulus bill that was passed in 2009, and it is more important than ever that government starts going to communities that are impacted by policies and speaking to community leaders, speaking to people who will receive and be the beneficiaries of government policies to understand what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And so it's a critically important part of the work that we need to do together and the work the federal government needs to do.
Yeah, so to address these issues, we both have to be really clear-eyed about the ways that places that we assume are nonpartisan and are sacred institutions in our democracy are being politicized and are being used as political footballs. And at the same time, we can't just accept that that's the way it's going to be, because if that is the way it becomes, we are really in trouble. Yeah. And we're in a place where that's the way it's been headed. So that's why it is so critical, and this is frankly, this is what motivates me every day, is that there's a tendency, I think it's really risky, even if there's, let's just say, one party that's posing more of a threat to our democracy, that's being more pernicious, to conflate sort of the political goals and incentives of the other party with just saving democracy. There's overlap, but there has to be an entire kind of interdisciplinary ecosystem of nonpartisan actors who are truly just working on behalf of democracy. Because if our system continues to work the way it is, and given the environment, we're going to continue to have kind of changes in power that happen quite rapidly. So we can't just accept or count on sort of one political party to save us. We have to be investing in the institutions, and we have to put the effort in, as difficult as it is, to embolden and empower people in really critical positions in our democracy, to kind of call them to their better angels, to give them the tools, to give them the incentives. And so what am I talking about specifically? If we looked at 2020, it was a time that, there's a mixed story. It's never black and white. There's a lot of nuance. So there was huge threat to our democracy. We responded in a pandemic in our election system, thanks to good work of people like Tiana and others, to adapt, to shift elections to be more vote by mail, more early in person, and to run, I think, arguably the best run elections that we've ever had. We had massive voter turnout, actually across all, rural voters, urban voters, voters of color, record turnout. We continue to have record turnout. So you could say, these are tremendous things. Well, there was also a lot of attacks on vote by mail. January 6th, the election, the legitimacy was challenged. It led to January 6th, all the lawsuits, all the fraud, all this stuff. So it's always a single story. And I raise all this just to say that we could just focus on, and the media tends to focus on, the threat and the challenge, but it's really incumbent upon us who are doing this work to really focus actually on what did work and double down and triple invest in that, because we need a lot more of that. We need both Republicans and Democrats because election administration positions, many of them are partisan. We need those who are going to be in those places to stand up and advocate for our democracy in the moments when it's critically important. So we have to continue to double down and triple down in what is working.
I'll be extraordinarily brief because Mindy took the words out of my mouth. The only way that I see us making it to the other side of this incredibly challenging moment in our democracy is if we have pro-voter, pro-democracy public officials who come together across difference in the interest of the public. When I thought about you asking this question, this is actually the place where I have hope from my vantage point, because the local election administrators that I get to work with in my daily life coming out of the 2020 election are one of the only communities of public officials across partisanship that have, with very, very, very few exceptions, stood together and told the truth about administering the highest turnout, most secure election in a century. That type of really excellent work has been vilified But it's exactly the type of responsive government of a community of public servants coming together in a crisis, figuring out how to respond to and meet the moment for their communities, doing that. And we need to shine light on those examples because they are what we need more of.
Sadia, do you mind if I just jump in again?
No, not at all.
Tiana, you and Mindy hit on something so important that I think I fail to do all the time when I talk about kind of how depressing it is and all the threats to our democracy. But you guys hit on kind of the hope and kind of what we, all the positives that we've seen. And one thing I would kick myself if I got off the stage without doing is I believe, and I think everybody on this stage believes, I think everybody in this room believes that all the problems we've talked about today have solutions and they are solvable. And, I think it's not going to be easy to solve them, but I think that's the thing. And I think that's what we need hope and optimism about not is about kind of the challenge that we face, not is it possible. And so I just wanted to really underscore that because I think that is something maybe that we get lost. I know I certainly get lost in as I get kind of stuck thinking about the problems and kind of the long road ahead. But I think, I think it is just really important to kind of focus on, one, the positive things we do see even today, day after day, even amidst all these crises, but also just kind of that underlying notion that these problems are solvable and we can do it. It's just going to be difficult.
And on that bright note, I'm going to turn it over to our audience. For questions, we have a couple of minutes, so if anyone wants to ask a direct question, I encourage you to do so. Yes. Sorry, we have a mic for the virtual audience.
Hi, thank you all for coming and speaking with us. So during the 2016 election, Donald Trump kind of started this idea of the big lie, saying, like, he kind of was floating this idea if he lost, it's because there was some sort of fraud, whatever it may be. Do you think if he did indeed lose in 2016 that we would have seen a January 6th? And if not, what changed over his presidency that led to January 6th? What changed in our society that led people to have this insurrection?
I'm happy to take this one first. So I don't think there would have been an insurrection if he had lost, even if he had tried to trump it at the time, that the election was rigged and it was false. And I'll tell you why. I think a lot of what we saw during the Trump administration was the coming out, so to speak, of people who shared particular views that they felt they were alone in sharing, right? So that means that some of these extreme views were not validated and they were not supported, and people did not think there was a community that viewed others as having those views. And I think that 4 years of President Trump validated a lot of, and look, I'm not saying whether they were valid or invalid, right? I'm just, and this is, some of this has been written about at length, some of it is just, my hypothesizing. And I think that through 4 years, because of President Trump's repeated statements via Twitter and elsewhere, with a media ecosystem that bolstered those statements and gave validity to it, it made people feel that there was truth in things that they suspected. And I just don't, without that continued parroting and validating and also demonstrable evidence that what people viewed could never happen. Let's be honest. I mean, no one was predicting. I mean, maybe I think there's like one pollster or something that predicted that Donald Trump was going to win in 2016 or whatever the number is. Mindy probably knows. And so because that administration validated folks' beliefs of what they may have wanted to happen or what they may have wanted to believe to be true, it led to more of a feeling of community and coordination amongst what was an extremist segment that came out on January 6th. That's my opinion.
I think what I would add to that about something that I think is really different, one of my reflections that I think is important is that you don't get to the version of the big lie that resulted in the January 6th insurrection without COVID denialism.
That's a good point.
And what I mean by that is that the stickiness of the argument that the former president was making was based on this idea that first it was a farce, that the pandemic was a serious challenge, and that farce was being manipulated by a political party to then change election rules to make it more permissible to vote by mail, and that these were all things that were deeply connected to this other lie around public health that I think was much stickier and touched people in an everyday way that created something, an environment for then the conspiracy theories that were built on top of it to take hold. And so the only way that I really understand the moment that we got to by January 6th and the environment that we've been in since 2020 is that intersection between the pandemic and the impact of that on every way that the public interacts and understands the world and the relationship between government and the election.
Can I just add one thing to that? By the way, I love this question. I feel like we could talk about it all day long in multiple panels, just that question. But the other reason, I agree that there wouldn't have been January 6th post-2016 for the reasons mentioned and others. And I want to name one specifically, which is Donald Trump was not president after 2016. And so in 2020, he had already, and not just January 6th, but why we came so close to the potential coup, like being successful, is because he was the president of the United States and he was able to weaponize or get close to weaponizing a lot of other institutions and leading institutional actors within his administration. And that was to me, that's the biggest difference, and also kind of speaks to the dangers about the future.
You took the words right out of my mouth, and I think, you don't have an insurrection, you don't have people storming the Capitol unless they believe, at least a part of them believes, that they are going to be successful. And that's because the president was telling them, go down there and do this, and I've got your back. They'd seen Donald Trump already go through one impeachment totally unscathed. They'd seen how Republicans in Congress and other positions of power rallied around. And so I think you're absolutely right. He, in 2016, if he had tried to do this, it would be as a failed political candidate. When he did this as president, he did this and it wasn't just him, right? I mean, now we're hearing day after day, there's more information coming out, but about how many people inside our government were involved in this conspiracy to use the Department of Justice to overturn the election. And so I think it just goes back. It goes to to exactly what you were saying, Mindy, is that they believed they could win because they had the president on their side.
Now, this is also why some law enforcement was stuck in paralysis.
Right.
Right, when insurrectionists actually were advancing upon the Capitol, because they didn't even know what they should do or who would have their back within the federal government if they did what they were trained to do.
Yeah.
So no one's telling me to stop, so I'm going to go for one more audience question, and then I'll stop.
Or we could just keep going with that
question.
So my question is that technology and data, the sheer volume of data, actually contributed to a lot of the lack of transparency in government that is there right now. How exactly are you planning to sort of reverse that with more data and newer technologies, which are worse, to be honest?
I love that question. I think one of the biggest critiques of the part of the field that I come from, civic technology, which is like a version of government 2.0, which is a version of what is open government. It's evolved, but there used to be this idea that if you collected a ton of information and then put it in an online portal for the public to access, then you are solving the challenge of making government more transparent. But in fact, what that allows folks to, what it really does is create a data set that very few people are able to access or make sense of. And so the way that we approach our work around civic information and connecting people with actionable information is by taking data and then understanding how we can serve it up to people in ways that are timely, that are relevant, and that they can act upon them, and that are personalized to their own context, and already make sense of the broader data that they live in. And so a concrete example of that is one of the data sets that we make available is allowing people to find out the candidates that are on their ballot. And if you just gave someone a spreadsheet full of everyone who is running for office across the country, that is not very helpful. But we make it possible for you to put in your specific address, and then you get returned exactly the candidates that would show up on your ballot, and are able to do more research. And you get that available to folks, right in advance of an election. And so it's really making sure that, from our perspective, that it's never about data for data's sake. It's about what problem are we trying to solve? Is there a role for data to support that? And then how do we actually make it, again, relevant, make it actionable, make it personalized, and make it timely for when people actually need it?
Yeah, I just exactly what you're saying on it's not data for data's sake. I say the same thing about transparency all the time. It's not transparency for transparency's sake. You've got to be thinking. And I think that's actually one of the best roles that civil society plays, at least at the federal level, as we come into these rooms, we're talking with folks in government who are thinking through like, how do I get the most information out there as soon as possible? And we're working with them on like, think about the user. What is a useful format for this information for the user? And I think I just think sometimes we forget kind of what is the purpose of this, and we've just got to keep that in mind of why are we doing this, and it's to connect people with information, not to just give them the information so they have it.
Yeah, I mean, the Plum Act that I mentioned earlier is a concrete example of this, right? The reason why you want to make a list of positions and who occupies those positions available to people is so they know who to appeal to if they identify a problem, or so the public can identify any even perceived conflicts of interest that may exist because of the occupant of that position and any financial interests or other interests that they may have that conflict with the responsibilities of that job, just to make it concrete.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I would just add, because maybe it will be the last word, is because it has evolved. So this is why I'm excited about this data and democracy program and working with them, is that now we have to think about it in more complex ways. It's not just about, okay, how do we organize the data? How do we collect the data? How do we make the data available? It's about the entire data journey, timely, relevant, and actionable, exactly as Tiana said, but also consumable, that it is getting more to the public, that they are actually using it, and that we are regularly assessing the impacts that it's having. And then the last thing I would also say is the other side of data is actual data sets, but it's also using data to listen. So the listening that Rudy talked about, I get really excited about the ability to use data to listen at scale, and then not just, again, report that out, but actually surface the insights that are going to be critical and work with decision makers to act upon those insights so that the data has a purpose in actually leading to more effective policymaking and governance.
So now I've not only gotten the signal, but I've gotten some texts as well. So on that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us here in person at the Keller Center at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and all of our viewers online. Thank you so much to our practitioner fellows for sharing just a bit of your story. We've got a whole year to build this out, and we're just thrilled to have you at the University of Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good job.